Jay Dyer from Jay's Analysis. Listen, I want to talk to you about the big story this week of WikiLeaks and the leaks of Vault 7, supposedly. Now, back in 1982, James Bamford wrote a famous book called The Puzzle Palace. And in chapter 10, as you can see, where he talks about the abyss, interesting title there, but they had the keyword echelon type technology back then in 1982. The NSA did, and this whole book is about cryptography in the NSA. So what we're seeing now is not actually new information. It's not actually new data. Then in 2008, James Bamford wrote The Shadow Factory, and as you can see, there's a whole chapter called The Wiretappers, and in that chapter he talks about Crystal City, which is an entire underground city near the Pentagon, just across the busy Interstate 393 from the Pentagon. Crystal City is a beehive of overweight contractors, military personnel, and spooks behind Ray-Bans. So, again, the whole idea of all of this wiretapping that we're hearing about, that Trump mentioned in regard to the Obama administration and Trump Tower, the left and the mainstream media are in a hissy fit over this, and they think that they finally got the gotcha moment with Trump where he stumbled up and said something retarded. But in actual fact, this is standard fare. Every presidential candidate, every member of Congress, every member of Senate, every judge is under surveillance, and that's as well as like heads of police department. And this is how the system ensures complicity. This is how they get their agenda through the New World Order, et cetera, is because they have all of the data. They know who's cheating with who's sleeping with who likes what their tastes are, right, in terms of their sexual proclivities. And that's because it's the most powerful tool for blackmail that's out there. All of this data, all of this information, and for a long time, at least 10 years at Jay's Analysis, and going back to my old website, I've been writing about this and talking about this stuff. So it's not new information. Bamford was writing about it in 1982. So it's a little bit odd. It's a little surprising that WikiLeaks is presenting this as if this is new information. I guess what it does show is more of the actual programs that the CIA is involved in using. And we've talked for a long time about backdoor technology. In my book, Esoteric Hollywood, I have a section where I talk about PROMIS and the backdoor technology that we saw even in movies like Sneakers from the 90s with Robert Redford and Dan Aykroyd. The whole movie is about the NSA inserting backdoor technology into various PCs and laptops and so forth. And what trade publications have said for a long time is that a lot of this backdoor stuff is actually inserted at the factory. So that's because the military-industrial complex has a direct relationship to the giant corporate complex that's out there. They're not separate entities. But what we're gonna talk about in this video is the breakdown of this myth, this lie that they've been trying to construct about the Russian narrative, and how everything that I've said in the last few months, my analysis has been completely correct. When I was on Red Ice twice talking about it, the video that I made that got around 80 to 100,000 views across different channels about Clinton and the WikiLeaks, my analysis there has been proven correct. So we're going to look at some evidence and some recent information that's come out that I think vindicates all that. Now, if you go back a few months ago when I was on with Tim Kelly, I was talking about this same stuff. If we want to understand what's going on with WikiLeaks, we need to go back to both the Syria situation and the Benghazi situation. And in terms of understanding Benghazi and Libya and how that was set up, the consulate there, and why that attack happened, that was set up to be a hub for running weapons and so forth to the jihadists who were there to take down Gaddafi. And what we're going to see is that the notion that that was all based on the loot that Gaddafi had, that the international Clinton Foundation globalist types wanted to get their hands on, is absolutely true, and is confirmed in the WikiLeaks. But notice first what I said several months ago.
And you start to notice that the idea occurred to me, and I was bouncing this idea off with Patrick too, and he thought so as well, that if you go back to these death squads of, say, Iran and Central Latin America that the CIA supported and trained for the paramilitary units and so forth, and if you look back to the death squads of Phoenix program in Vietnam, you start to see these patterns. And so what I think probably was happening was that you were getting research being done simultaneously with these operations being run on how to conduct and effectively cause regime change and cause large-scale social engineering, right? So all those sort of tied together. Now, that's not to say that the nationalist-minded or secular-minded or Soviet-minded individuals in these different states during the Cold War were, quote, good. It's just to say that when a corporation or a Rockefeller institution or an oil entity connected to the Rockefellers or whatever wanted a regime change for business purposes, this is how they would start doing it, especially during the Cold War. So I think this technique was perfected during the Cold War, and it utilizes a bunch of different styles of warfare. And so the interview that I did with Andrew Karibko, I think, went really well, and I read his book and another ebook on this topic, and it really starts to put the puzzle pieces together. And if you're not familiar with the Middle East, that's understandable. Again, it's a very complex, very long history, very difficult topic, but I think you really can begin to put these pieces together. And it starts, I think, with looking at operations like how they would run death squads, how they would do Phoenix program, and what those operations were useful for in terms of long-term regime change methods and strategies and techniques. So then we fast forward to modern day, and what we learn is that a lot of these techniques have been tied into public reports and documentation on things like swarming. So the Rand Corporation has this whole document where they talked about the methods of, they call it utilizing swarming adolescents. That's what they call it. And this is a technique where you do rent-a-mobs or create a mob. Now,
yes, yeah.
The George Webb guy has been doing on YouTube where he talks about where is Eric Braverman. Mm-hmm. And he's done like 30 of these. Now, I think he tends to believe a little more is real than I do, but he is sketching out some very interesting connections. And one of those is that he poses the thesis that the Hillary campaign was funneling money, basically selling off kickbacks for what you would get when she achieved the regime change, right? So if you donated to the Clinton Foundation and Hillary's campaign, basically, say you put $1 million in, well, when I move into Libya, we're going to give you a cut of, what we divvy up there. So that's it, and that makes a lot of sense, especially when you go back and in Tony Cartolucci's book, which I do recommend, even though it's dated, it's actually a free ebook. It's called War on Syria, Gateway to World War III. Just a free PDF you can find. It's really, really good, though. It's heavily documented. It lays it all out. So I want to give credit to Tony Cartolucci for what he's written, and then Brandon Turbeville's book on Syria, which is also like a $3 ebook, Kindle book, which is really good as well. So reading those two in tandem, I think, can give you a good background of what we're seeing here. And then when we start to think about the older models of, as I said, excuse me, the regime change through black ops and death squads from the 50s and 60s and so forth, 70s, 80s, you start to see all of these things are not, they're connected in the sense that these NGOs and think tanks have for decades been studying the techniques of regime change and how to most effectively do it. And then, of course, how to use the internet to interact with this. And this is where we get the Arab Spring and the hashtag revolutions. And you even had Eric Schmidt, or not Eric Schmidt, but one of the Google tech guys bragging about how the Arab Spring would not have been successful, the removal of Mubarak, without Twitter and Google participating in helping that to go forward. And again, it doesn't mean that the people in power were good guys. It just means that this is the technique, the technology of how they're doing it. Now, you go and you look at the Gene Sharp who I've talked about many times at the Albert Einstein Institute, red flag there, who is a Princeton professor who specializes in the technology of how to achieve, quote, democratic revolution. You watch this 3-minute video with this guy, and excuse my language, you've got these generals who come on, and they're like, some people have said we're part of the CIA, and I say, F you! I'm not joking. You watch that 3-minute video about color revolutions and Gene Sharp. It's a popular video on YouTube. And Eugene Sharp comes on and he says, "Oh yes, I've been a professor for many years, studying the technique of democratic revolutions and regime change." And once you understand all of this stuff that we're talking about, you're going to immediately look at that and you see right through that. This is not democratic revolutions in these countries. This is removing people that are no longer amenable to Washington and banker corporate interests. And then that's what it amounts to.
Yeah, their shelf life has expired.
Exactly. And now, so when we go back to 2011, lo and behold, I couldn't believe when I was reading this. The Brookings Institute wrote a famous paper, and the paper is called Libya's Test of the New International Order. And in February of 2011, they say, we're going to remove Gaddafi and divvy up the resources. So here you go. I mean,
So if we come over here to the Brookings Institute and their piece that they wrote back in February 26, 2011 by Salman Sheikh, we see that they talked about as I mentioned in that interview that I did, and I've mentioned that several times now in interviews in the last several months, is that they telegraphed ahead of time everything that they were going to do in terms of Libya. And what do? Oh, well, you call out that there's all these crimes against humanity, the standard stuff, right? Just like with Saddam, just like with anybody else that needs to be removed, quote unquote, because of, quote, crimes against humanity. And then they repeat this narrative with Assad, right around this same time. And in fact, you can go back into the Bush administration where they were preparing the removal of Assad. It actually goes back to 2007, 8, around in there. I think there's Newsweek articles that discuss that. But Gaddafi is said to be here a threat to the West and all this nonsense, and that he's allied with Eurasian interests, and so therefore he needs to be removed. And we got Human Rights Council, right? This is all the Gene Sharp bullshit that we talked about before, that I was talking about with Tim Kelly, and that I've mentioned many times in interviews. And who do we see come to the fore here? Well, Hillary Rodham Clinton has decided to set up an international commission of inquiry to investigate alleged violations of human trafficking, humanitarian law in Libya. Can't you hear Hillary shrieking with her harpy wraith voice over this, right? So this is all a bunch of nonsense that was the supposed basis. And just like I was saying, and like Mr. Webb talked about in his videos, and you go over here to the WikiLeaks, and back in 2011, from Sidney Blumenthal to Hillary Clinton, they were talking about, in this WikiLeaks email that was released, Gaddafi having all these resources and the gold. So that was absolutely 100% true. That's not a conspiracy theory. Here they are talking about it. And how, look, I mean, let's put two and two together here. What was Hillary promising upon her election? That anyone that had put money into the pay-to-play thing and that had put money into her campaign would get benefits. You'd get kickbacks. You would get some kind of corporate deal or whatever if you had donated to the campaign. So that, in other words, Libya would be divvied up and given to the corporate interests that had put money into the Hillary campaign. That's how this whole thing works. And so this also ties into the human trafficking and all the pedo stuff. And that's why that was such a big deal when that came out in the previous batch of WikiLeaks emails with Podesta and all that, because it was showing how the blackmail works and how the operations all tie together. And they are all tied together. And it's just basically one giant onion ring of scams and Ponzi schemes and tricks. And what they do is they use all this NGO cover to supposedly, care about these people, and they care about the children, and they care about the poor and all this bullshit. And really all it is about how to achieve regime change to divvy up the country for banking and corporate interests in the U.S. and in London and presumably Tel Aviv as well. So like I said in the last video that I made, Hillary Clinton, the WikiLeaks email, bombshell, I talked about further evidence of this from the Council on Foreign Relations, where they write about the need for the use of the Free Syrian Army, which are Al-Qaeda. Admitted here, right? Al-Qaeda fighters might help improve morale. So the influx of jihad into Syria would bring discipline, fervor, and battle experience from Iraq, right? And that this would help the Free Syrian Army, which needs Al-Qaeda. They need this radicalized element because they're just not doing good enough in toppling Assad, right? This is the skeleton key that the West has used since the 70s, and the British intelligence prior to that were very fond of using Wahhabism, Salafism, radical Islam as their means by which they could take down opponents. And it also provides then a very useful basis for coming into the region later to restructure it. So once you fund and arm and aid the jihad, then they wreck the place. Then it's we got to go in there and stop ISIS. We got to go in there and stop Al Qaeda. We got to stop this threat. And then that means Coke, Pepsi, Halliburton, vaccines, and all this come in. So that's the next stage in the process. And this is the same thing they do every time. And those companies coming in, as I said, is the means by which Hillary repays, right, the dividends to her supporters, right? So once you've put in money to this is, all of these bankers that we talked about last time, these corporate people, Comey and having these connections to HSBC. Once you put in all that money, then when the country's divvied up from the regime change and from the Al-Qaeda, ISIS, jihad that's been destroyed, it's been bombed, then the West comes in with its companies that have paid money into the Clinton Foundation and into her campaign, and she then allows these corporations to come in and, quote, rebuild, thereby creating a new market, thereby setting up some new monetary, IMF scam with the bailout, right, the shock doctrine. So this is the same cycle. This is the same model that they use every single time, and they do it because it's a technology that works. People fall for it. They're too stupid to figure out the labyrinth of different connections here. And when it's not actually that difficult, all it is the same model of regime change over and over and over. And it uses all the same media tricks and tactics of false stories in the news, false humanitarian crises. This is why they recently said, foreign policy, for example, said that they were not happy about Trump potentially cutting USAID. And now let's take a look at that. Why would they be mad about Trump cutting USAID money? Now, USAID, and Red Cross and all these kind of so-called NGO humanitarian operations are merely aspects of the shadow government. Now, look at this. Foreign policy now has a section at their site called shadow government. What a joke. And what do they say here? Trump's cuts to USAID would imperil the United States. Oh, yes, please, Trump, don't cut all of our CIA covert funding. Then we won't be able to accomplish all of our corporate looting in all these other countries that we destroy. But that's exactly what this is about, right? They're saying that, Trump claims to want to support national security, but how can he keep America safe without all of our giant NGO scam complex that's all throughout the world? Yes, we have to keep that in place. Otherwise, we're just going to have ISIS attacks, Islamic attacks, right? Now, wait a minute. What were they saying 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, a month ago, when Trump was talking about instituting the travel ban? They were saying that there are no terrorists. That's crazy. There's no terrorists in these countries. There's no jihad that we have to worry about. Trump is just a racist. Now what are they saying? The NGO complex keeps us safe from all of the barbaric extremism. Now, wait a minute. How is this not racist, right? According to Foreign Policy, which published all the exact same nonsense that was a contradiction to what they're saying now a month ago, right? USAID comes in here because it It provides water, electricity, healthcare, and U.S. assistance. No, what this means is that this operation goes in, and not only do they utilize these covers to aid and supply and fund their jihad, under these NGO type covers, or conducting espionage operations. This is classic cover, right? Through missionary work, through USAID, through Red Cross work. Not only that, but what they're talking about here with providing water, electricity, humanitarian assistance, give me a freaking break. If any of that is done, that's only done as a cover so that the corporations can then set up their new market there, right? That's what this is all about. Or the child trafficking. This was what we saw in Haiti, right? That's what the aid there was all about, was, we're going to go down there and help all the poor little black babies. Yeah, right. Like they give a damn about the black babies, because they were just talking in one of the WikiLeaks emails. Hillary knew that blacks would be killed in their operation in Libya, and of course did not give a damn, because it's all a big joke. They don't care about race. All they care about is setting up a new market in these different regions. That's how the whole kit and caboodle works. That's what the whole presidential election, at least in terms of Hillary, was about. Now, this is why Trump is different, because Trump doesn't need any of that. He's not interested in toppling and benefiting from Gaddafi. He's independently wealthy, right? Why does he need? He doesn't need Gaddafi's wealth. But that's what this was all about, was looting the nationalization programs that Gaddafi had put into effect and reducing that place to a third world savage barbaric situation, a failed state. Now, as I was saying in other interviews, the collapse of the liberal world order, this is what I mentioned on the Red Ice interviews, is they've been talking about this since 2016 at Foreign Policy in these big white papers and think tank publications, and they say that the world is entering this new period where democracy is dying. But that's, of course, only if you believe in the fictitious notion of democracy. There's no such thing as democracy. Democracy is not real. Really what democracy is the cover, the covert, it's the wearing the American flag, so, right? And then when you go into the other countries, you bomb them to achieve regime change for your corporate masters. That's what it really is. And so what's funny about this warning piece that Stephen Walt of Foreign Policy has been, and he's actually been writing a whole bunch of these over the last several months, where they talk about the fact that the white papers, the World Economic Forum, what I've been saying, right, for the past several months, because of what they're saying, is that the liberal world order is being challenged by a whole bunch of forces such as nationalism, anti-liberalism, and what they try to use a pejorative of fundamentalist movements, which is ridiculous, right? So Brexit, Le Pen, Trump, Farage, these types of things, which are not perfect, they're not that great in many situations, in many cases, different aspects are not that great. But if you look at it overall, it's the logical reaction to globalism and the global order that we've been talking about for so long. The things that Carol Quigley talked about that I did in my entire 8-series lecture on the whole 1,300 pages of that book. That is the liberal world order. And they're saying that it's all pessimism, right? If you don't believe in globalism and total open borders, you're a xenophobic, racist, pessimist. When in actual fact, it's the other way around, of course, with all this nonsense, is that we believe in optimism. We're the optimists as persons who believe in tradition, who believe in organic cultures, who believe in healthy societies, who have real free markets and real trade, not this crony model, not this crony capitalist model that these people are all obsessed with, because they know it wrecks societies, they know it destroys societies, and democracy is the chief weapon by which they use to wreck and destroy these societies. And they even talk about their fears that Poland, Hungary, and even Israel heading in illiberal directions. That's because people are starting to realize that once you unleash the Titan, the Pandora's box of democracy and egalitarianism and all this crap that's not true, it wrecks the whole society, right? And so you might have thought as a technocrat that you could release all this stuff and control it, but in actual fact you can't. It's a total inversion and subversion of everything existing prior. And if the whole narrative of Darwinian nonsense is not true, then this will not work, right? And of course it's not true, as I've done many videos showing that it's not true. Therefore, it's doomed to fail. It's doomed to not work. And all it does is destroy everything. Now, granted, they believe that destabilization and destruction by design, which Stephen Mann talks about in his papers, Army PSYOPs documents where they talk about controlled chaos and controlled destruction and destabilization. But the question is, can you actually really control this chaos? I don't think you can, especially not when now we're being told that little boys have to hack their penises off, right? That's not Russia telling us that, right? It's the Western globalist establishment that's saying this. So part of the reason for all of this is internal battles within the establishment for funding. Now, that's just one level of this problem, because really what you have is different competing corporations and private intelligence entities or whatever it might be that want to have access to the pot, right? So the public funds, the taxpayer money, is all going to be allocated by these government officials to different agencies, different entities, different private organizations for intelligence, surveillance, whatever, right? And this goes back to like the Pentagon Papers, all the way back to Ellsberg, which I think was a kind of Rand Corporation psyop. It was a limited hangout. And Steve Pieczenik, Dr. Pieczenik here, is actually going to explain a lot of this process. I think he's absolutely correct. He's given the consistent analysis of what's going on here in regard to how, as I've said, Snowden is obviously some kind of cutout figure. And so what happens is that you get this Snowden character, you get a WikiLeaks type character with Assange, and they do drop real information. But the problem is that a lot of times this information is already old. It's already known, as I pointed out at the very beginning of this video with the Bamford books. They talked about all this stuff decades ago. But so listen to what Dr. Pieczenik says here about Snowden. And this is from a few years ago. And I think it's relevant because it's going to show you sort of the inside baseball of how these different agencies are actually also vying for funding. And he's going to mention, for example, $60 billion here. So that's a big part of this, especially when it comes to cyber warfare and cybercom. And with all of these leaks, what you're going to get in the next 5 to 10 years is corporations and companies that are going to come along and say, oh, we're going to be the solution to all of these leaks, right? Because there will be false flags and false leak flags, which the Vault 7 WikiLeaks stuff even mentions, with the CIA and all their malware having the ability to puppet or use dummy spoofing type things to portray Russians as who's hacking everything, when they have the ability to do basically a cyber false flag. But before we get to that, listen to what Pieczenik says here, because it's very relevant to what we're seeing now.
Very simply, I started to think of Snowden a long time ago. As I was saying, I thought he was and analyzing him not as an American but as a counterintelligence operative or somebody who's had experience in counterintelligence. I thought Snowden was very much what I call the manufactured avatar of the American intelligence community. What do I mean by that? I started looking at tapes of Edward Snowden when he was giving these bombastic interviews, self-aggrandizing interviews to the German press and other presses. But in the recent press, in a recent interview, he very clearly stated to the Germans, yes, I was in the special forces, but I broke my ankle. Now, that was not credible to me, because if you're in the special forces, you don't just break your ankle and you don't leave. But he went on to explain that the special forces was something that was a noble endeavor on his part, and he saw it as a magnifier of military power. In other words, he gave me an explanation that was inconsistent with being a subcontractor. Mm-hmm. Then he went on to really indict himself by saying in the interview, I'm a CIA operative. I was recruited by the CIA and then the NSA. So what I'm getting at very quickly was, Snowden is very typical of what we in the intelligence community would want to do, and that is to create an avatar or a image of a person who may be a traitor or a whistleblower, so that we allow the American public to play off either part of two figures that the intelligence community creates. On the one hand, the intelligence community creates this incredible massive surveillance, where at the same time they want to make sure that they are not acquitted, that they're not judged harshly, so that they make sure they can control the narrative. So they create somebody like Snowden, or in the case that I was talking about as well, is Ellsberg, who also had a similar history, where he was involved in the Vietnam War, was a CIA operative on the State Department cover for a general who was called the Quiet American, and he then went out and revealed the Pentagon Papers from Rand Corporation. I subsequently went to the Rand Corporation, and there where I find what's his name? I find Ellsberg. I find him at the MIT Center where I'm trained, and everyone there, except for myself, is trained to go into the CIA. So I realized the CIA was really nurturing and initiated a lot of Ellsberg's Pentagon Papers. At the same time, they kept him safe at MIT. And very similar to the Snowden affair. Now, why would Snowden attack James Clapper and attack General Keith Alexander, the NSA chief? The reason was there's an initial tension throughout the past 30 years between our civilian intelligence, which is only 1/15 of the major intelligence bureaus that we have. We have 16 major intelligence units. 15 of them are in the military, and the 16th one is the CIA, a civilian one. For 30 years, there's always been this inherent tension. However, there is what we call the IC, the intelligence community, which at times gets together and decides, look, we have to have a common interest. The common interest now is that we made a mistake in Iraq. We went into Afghanistan. That's a mistake. We have to have a diversion, and as a diversion, we have people like James Clapper, where we created this office of DNI, Director of National Intelligence, which is absolutely absurd. This was an unnecessary organization that was created out of a false flag and a stand-down that we've talked about before with Alex Jones after 9/11. James Clapper is a decent man. He came in. He was from the Air Force. He was military. Keith Alexander created the NSA. But in turn, the entire intelligence community said, look, we're still going to control the narrative of everything that occurred from 9/11 to stand down to Afghanistan to Iraq by creating a good guy who can be seen as a good guy, a whistleblower, or a traitor. And as long as we can create that narrative, we are really in control of the game. And that's where the American people have been had. Now, why would they control a game, and what's the game? Mm-hmm. The game is about $60 billion worth of subcontracting from the Pentagon to companies, at least $6 billion going to Booz Allen. Now, who is Booz Allen? Booz Allen is a consulting firm that I knew in Bethesda that was totally ineffective, controlled by John Michael McConnell, who was former military DCI and vice chairman and was in the head of the NSA, who was closely tied to another man, John Brennan of the CIA, who controls that now, who was also involved with James Woolsey, who was director of the CIA, and James Clapper, all of whom belonged to Booz Allen. So you have this game going on where Snowden, in an apparently bizarre story, reveals all these millions of secrets, which we don't really know about, but some of it is somewhat revealing to somebody. And it says that we, the United States, have been monitored. So what? We've been monitored in the 50s, and Google and Amazon and all the rest of these private companies have been monitoring us more effectively than NSA. And Snowden goes to Hong Kong, which is not a real safe place, and then ostensibly goes to Russia, where Putin takes care of him. Well, I said to you, Putin has been really an ally. He's taken care of all the people who we don't want to have as leaders of a country, and he takes care of our transit points into Afghanistan. But in the meanwhile, who are the people involved? We have John Brennan of the CIA, which Snowden doesn't say a word about. And he admits readily, I'm a CIA operative. Yet he destroys some CIA assets. But in the meantime, really the game goes on. Then he talks about Booz Allen, but he really doesn't go into detail how Booz Allen has taken a $6 billion contract and then enhanced it in conjunction with other intelligence contracts from the Pentagon up to $60 billion. And the American public, that's you and I, are paying for an intelligence that's not worth anything. On the same time, not only is the game played out between Snowden being a spy or a whistleblower, but at the meantime, there's a notion from Keith Alexander and James Clapper in these meetings in front of Congress, which are disingenuous meetings, that we have a clear and present danger. Well, we don't have a clear and present danger. We don't have terrorists who we've picked up and protected us from these massive explosions. This whole terrorist nonsense has been created by Cheney, Bush, Kagan, Nuland, a whole group of neocons, in order to justify our presence and an expansion into the Middle East, which has failed dramatically. And so what's happened in return is we've created this monstrosity of an intelligence community, which is neither intelligent nor an effective community, but is sucking out the very lifeline of our country. And I say that as an American citizen, not as an intelligence operative who's overseeing these guys. From an intelligence point of view, I've told them repeatedly, I would have fired every one of them. I would have knocked out every one of these 16 agencies because they stovepipe. And now we're going to have a new leader of the NSA, Mike Rogers, an admiral, who really doesn't know anything about this. He's not even the equivalent intellectually or in terms of experience of a Keith Alexander, who was head of MI, Military Intelligence, G2, and is significantly smarter. Whatever mishaps Keith Alexander's done was done in the process of building up massive surveillance, which we didn't necessarily need, but will not be effective. So in the process of all of this going on, we do not have an oversight committee. Dianne Feinstein is an antiquated, God only knows, disaster of a woman, of a legislator. We have Nancy Pelosi. We have Mike Rogers. We have all these nonsensical representatives on the Democrat and Republican side who really are beholden to the intelligence community because their communities have intelligence contracts through Booz Allen or L3.
They're sycophants. Let me ask you this, Dr. Pachenik. Now, we've got the civilian versus the military side of the intelligence community you pointed out. You've talked about that kind of internecine fighting going on as being the roots of Benghazi. But are they just incompetent when they put these Snowden documents out because they've really public opinion is not really of a mind to give them a blank check right now, even though it seems like they're getting everyone more or less adjusted to the new way of thinking about the government, that they're going to monitor everything that we have. And we've got this discussion going on as to whether there is going to be anything such as privacy. So is this a limited hangout, or is this internecine warfare, or are they trying to build up the intelligence community but just doing it in a ham-fisted, incompetent way that they're really losing public opinion on this?
I think the latter is probably the best way. You've explained it very well. I think it's a ham-fisted, incompetent way. As I said in the blog, and we've just talked about it, the Army has really gone off on its own. It's built its own capacity and capability to invade absolutely nothing and to be able to really get into no combat whatsoever. But irrespective of that, the Army has become a Centurion Army or an Imperial Army, which is not beholden to the United States. In the same nature, we have a very heavy-handed intelligence community which is not effective at all. Our human is not effective. Our ELINT is not effective. Our capacity to do massive surveillance is really not effective. We have not picked up any terrorists. All we do is really to counter-effect what's called industrial espionage. But it's not relevant to our livelihood. Our private companies are far more effective, and they move more quickly than the NSA could, or even our whole government could, as most people realize. But what they care about the most, the intelligence and the military community, is their own perpetuation as an entity. They don't give a damn really about what Americans have to say or American civilians. What they care about is that the legislators and the representatives, remember, we're in a republic, not a democracy, that they allocate the amount of monies that are required to maintain a minimal standing force in the military and a massive presence of intelligence, which is not really effectively intelligence. So you have this added burden. They've literally added a second appendix to a body. Literally, you don't need the DNI. That came out after 9/11. Well, 9/11 was a stand down. So when you look at it, we created our own. We don't need an integrated unit that then integrates other integrated units, which never become integrated. It's kind of a Alice in Wonderland phenomenon, and they don't care what the Americans say because they know that the legislators will keep on talking about clear and present dangers.
Yeah, I find it interesting that Glenn Greenwald said that the most sensational things he was holding for his soon-to-be-released book, his movie, and the media empire that he's creating with one of the world's wealthiest billionaires, Pierre Omidyar. What do you think is going to come of that? Is that something that's really going to change public opinion, or is the public just too dumb and too numb to do anything about it?
I don't think the public is dumb. I think the American people have been clearly underestimated. I think they're inured to the whole thing. I said from day one to some of my friends that nobody really cares about Snowden and nobody cares about Greenwald. And just what you said was right on the button. That is, Greenwald, whoever he may be or not be, his interest is the same as the interest of the intelligence community, which is to create money, create notoriety, and perpetuate his own narcissism. No one in the United States or the world really will care very much. As you see, there's a movie about Julian Assange, WikiLeaks. Nobody even sees it. Nobody really cares. And the notion that we're being monitored is kind of passé. Everybody who deals with the internet, anybody who deals with iPads or iPhones, they know almost automatically that this is a new era. This is an era which is not going to have sensationalism as it's portrayed. And in many ways, the intelligence community, the military community, really didn't understand the American mentality of saying, so what? Or as my daughter would say, whatever. So what? And it's no big thing. The only thing I'm saying that's major about this is that you can't continue this falderall, this nonsense, at the cost of $80 billion a year.
Yes.
We have that need for that money for too many other things.
Yes, the military-industrial complex is bankrupting us. And
so what this reminds us of is even going all the way back to the 70s with Watergate and the Nixon resignation over the Watergate wiretapping scandal. And what's funny is that this is like 10,000 times more scandalous than Watergate. And what does the mainstream media do? Well, they ignore it. They ignore everything that's in WikiLeaks, even though all this information was already out, as I'm going to show you here in a minute. But quickly, let's just brush up on Watergate real quick. And we're going to think, too, about movies that were actually coming out at that time, particularly a couple Gene Hackman films that are curiously relevant to this present situation.
Congress then passed sweeping legislation. Yesterday, police here in Washington arrested 5 men for breaking into the office of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate Hotel. Little did most Americans know it would become a scandal so big it would take down a president. At the time, though, those arrests happened with little fanfare. And soon after President Nixon was reelected, it's what slowly unraveled after his reelection that led to what we now simply call Watergate, otherwise known as the worst political scandal in history. The burglary was one thing, but what's not often discussed is the amount of money Nixon raised just beforehand, about $20 million, which would equal about $110 million today. Much of that from large corporations, illegally, and all of it done so early on to avoid disclosure rules that would soon go into effect. Now, much of that came out in the hearings on Capitol Hill, and after Watergate, 20 corporations were criminally convicted for illegal campaign finance activities. Congress then passed sweeping legislation, campaign finance reforms, that would remain in place for years. The wounds of Watergate, you could say, were deep enough. Both lawmakers and the American people felt action was necessary. But fast forward to today, and many of those lessons have been forgotten. The law is not only done away with, but made much worse by the Supreme Court decision in the case of Citizens United. President Obama criticized it, and for once, Senator John McCain agreed. Here he is on NBC's Meet the Press.
I think there will be scandals as associated with the worst decision of the United States Supreme Court in the 21st century. Uninformed, arrogant, naive.
Those are harsh words, and as we reflect on the Watergate anniversary and how far we've come since then, I think the better question is to ask, what have we learned? Some would argue nothing at all. Dan Egan of the Washington Post writes, 4 decades later, there's little need for furtive fundraising or secret handoffs of cash. Many of the corporate executives convicted of campaign finance crimes during Watergate could now simply write a check to their favorite super PAC, or, if they want to keep it secret, to a compliant nonprofit group. Corporations can spend as much as they want to help their favorite candidates, no longer prohibited by law from spending company cash on elections. Now, Watergate gave us a few things. The first and only president to resign from office, a bright light shone on hardcore reporting and investigative journalism, like work done by Washington Post reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. And of course, it gave us the word gate attached to every modern day scandal. Well, today, millions of dollars go to prop up campaigns of would-be office holders in secret, and it is allowed. So I think it's important when we talk about campaign finance scandals now to consider that one of them was signed, sealed, and delivered by our third branch of government, the United States Supreme Court.
Now, isn't that rich from McCain? John McCain, who meets with the terrorists, he fights with the terrorists with ISIS. He's a good fighter. He fought in the War of 1812. Here's John McCain meeting with the so-called Free Syrian Army, al-Nusra, right? And these are the great freedom fighters, the great American freedom fighters that are our proxy army, right? I say American because they're actually just CIA-controlled foreign operatives here. And you have a clear manifestation of this. These are the same people, by the way, in the background, these characters who were photographed in a lot of the White Helmets videos, right? So the Soros, NGO, UK-funded, CIA-funded White Helmets stuff that won an Oscar, right? The White Helmets win an Oscar, which is fitting because it is a lot of theatrics and a lot of stage management that got them to where they are. This phony sort of humanitarian first responder situation, right? Which just happens to be there with film crews as they only apparently save little children, right? This is what we constantly see with the White Helmets, and we've done countless videos and countless articles. You can find all those at 21st Century Wire. I was just on Ground Zero with Clyde Lewis last week discussing the White Helmets and the Oscars, so you can check that out if you want. Here's a brief recap of what we talked about.
Out of the sky, and so they had to create some scenario that wasn't real. And in fact, if you hear, both Cheney and Rumsfeld have slipped many times saying that they shot that plane out of the sky. Jay Dyer with us tonight on Ground Zero, 888-673-3700. Hollywood is full of propaganda, and they award it. Create heroes. They use films to do so. We have like films, The Sniper, and we had Zero Dark 30 that was about the Osama bin Laden raid. When they want to push a certain type of fiction, they'll use Hollywood to do it. And I think it was interesting to note that a lot of this, some of the more, I guess you could say, blatant examples were during the Obama administration. Would you agree, Jay?
Yeah, actually, I was going to mention, we were talking about White Helmets, the work of Vanessa Beeley and Ava Bartlett and Patrick Henningsen is pretty top-notch over 21st Century Wire, and they have a whole bunch of articles, but even outside of that, in the mainstream press, back in November of 2014, the New York Times reported on Norwegian filmmakers being busted for filming fake Syria videos. A similar story around the same time, or actually, 2016, Egyptian police arrest 5 people for using children to stage fake Aleppo footage, and that's out of The Independent. So both New York Times and The Independent have commented on this. We've actually collected together, I've done a video that's about 2 hours long where I collect together as many of the clips that relate to this as I could find that actually demonstrate usage of totally staged and fake videos. Not just my opinion, but actually instances of people being caught doing this. And so like the BBC, and if you remember the story of Syrian Danny and the chlorine gas false flag nonsense that they were talking about, these are all examples. And actually, when you start chronicling these, there's more than you can keep up with. There's actually so many examples of this. And what you start to realize is, okay, so White Helmets is basically a film crew / first responder group that's able to get there on the scene ASAP and construct the narrative.
Right.
And they're constructing the narrative, obviously, for the CIA, for the West, for the UK Foreign Office, who's funding them, who's put the millions of dollars into this so-called humanitarian organization, but it's not. It's just a complete propaganda front. And what's funny about that is that I was reviewing a lot of Kubrick films recently for a TV show I'm working on, and I noticed as I was watching Full Metal Jacket, I haven't watched that in probably 8 years, when the Joker character, who's the guy who lives through the big guy who commits suicide and kills the drill sergeant, the next phase of the film, the second act of the film, the main character is Joker. And if you remember what his role is, it's to go to Vietnam as a journalist, quote unquote, and his whole job is to basically be like Winston in 1984 and craft and create news stories for the people back home.
Now, when it comes to the situation of General Flynn, my entire analysis that I gave in regard to his being ousted as a result of the deep state, which the liberal media even admitted that this was a machination of the deep state, particularly that Clinton Soros faction of the deep state that we've been talking about here, they ousted Flynn in the same narrative, with the same narrative that they're using to try to oust Sessions. And the Sessions situation proves my analysis that I gave, as you'll see here.
In Washington, D.C., and whether or not he forgot to tell Vice President, Mike Pence, that's another issue, I think. But Jay, tell us what's going on here and why there's been such immense controversy surrounding this issue.
Well, it represents the interior battle within the deep state that we've seen going on for probably a long time, but most clearly manifested in the recent presidential election. So the election of Trump represents at least one side of the deep state. I think you could argue that perhaps is not as insane, perhaps not as fiercely global. They would like to, probably for many cases, business interests. They're not happy with things like Obamacare, right? I mean, this has done a lot of damage to industry and to medium to smaller size companies in the U.S. And so I have to think that not everybody is on board with globalism, even in the power structure. So I think that they aided and they chose a candidate who they felt would be more amenable to their interests. And so what we've actually been seeing is this kind of internal struggle that's playing out over time throughout this presidential campaign, interestingly. And so we are seeing a real resurgence of ideas that are flawed in themselves. I mean, Americanism, in my view, is a flawed philosophy. But I think that what we're seeing is people trying to put a halt on this madness of what is accurately called globalism. I mean, they ironically sit here and tell us that there's no such thing as globalism in the very publications that tout globalism. So, I mean, they're running nonstop Orwellian doublespeak psyops. Yeah, and we'll get to that, these foreign policy articles here in a minute that are great. But so what we see with Flynn, I think, is a situation where somebody who tended to speak in neocon terms quite often. In fact, he supported the U.S. operation in Kiev to put in Yatsenyuk and then Poroshenko. So it probably looked as if this guy was going to be something of a neocon. And then we're supposed to believe that somehow he's tied into the Russians. And what I think that this is really just to feed into this completely concocted, made up, nonsensical scenario by factions such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Clintons, the Clinton Foundation, and their arms of the CIA and the NSA that do not like Trump. And so you have that big faction that wants to charge forward with the globalism. And what we mean by the globalism there is just more of the Soros so-called democracy, more of this nonsense through the NGOs and foundations that you and I talked about last time, furthering that narrative in all these other countries, working actually, as we've seen, hand in hand with the State Department, right? Victoria Nuland and the Soros Foundation working together in these other countries to further Washington's foreign policy, which is just the foreign policy of, as we said, these globalist interests, Wall Street, right? Saudi Arabia, Clinton Foundation, all of these entities that I think are the biggest juggernaut, the main danger
And so this ousting is a kind of mini coup, if you will, to, I think, disrupt what's going on that's positive in the Trump administration, to rein it back under the umbrella of the neocons.
I know that there's some in the administration now that, maybe people from our perspective more or less wouldn't be that happy with. There's some ex-Goldman Sachs people in there, like Mnuchin, etc. But I find it interesting that it seems that foreign policy has been the most important issue to them. In other words, here is the first guy they really take out and topple, because foreign policy, that must be to them the number one issue, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly, and that's why I saw Trump as at least the most hopeful candidate in terms of altering the foreign policy. That's at least what he campaigned on. We all know that. And the unfortunate things that we've seen this week, I'm hoping can be overcome. Hopefully they're just sort of road bumps. We've actually seen the Trump administration and his people be very crafty. So, yes, and when I mentioned them being crafty, the response this week with Vault 7 was very crafty. This was the rejoinder from the Trump side of things to counter the wiretapping, right? So obviously Trump was under surveillance and the Trump transition team. How else would they have known that Flynn had this communication, which was innocent, by the way, with the Russians, right? That shows they had the wiretapping and the surveillance going, because all they wanted this whole time was to in some way try to capture Trump doing something wrong or some way that they could exploit it. And since they can't find anything, they're having to try to construct this narrative. This is what the whole story of the Russian hack has been this whole time, because they want to get rid of Trump and put somebody else in, somebody that's more like Hillary. And that's just totally obviously manifest now. And everything that I've been saying for the last several months is proven to be correct. My analysis has been spot on. To demonstrate a lot of this, we're going to rewind again and go back to 2012. Spencer Ackerman at Wired magazine published this piece, which was a pretty big deal at the time, and I guess everybody's forgotten it. I haven't forgotten it, though, because the CIA chief said, at that time it was Petraeus, "We will spy on you through your dishwasher." So again, none of this is new, right? Personal and household devices will be connecting information through the internet, through your television, through your navigation systems. Now, remember, this is the Internet of Things, right? This is the CIA venture capital front that created Facebook. And this is ultimately intended to create an Internet of Things. And this is where you're going to get smart homes. I was working at AT&T just a few years ago, and they were already training on selling the implementation of the smart home. You could get the smart home package if it was available in your area due to, if you had the highest level internet connection and so forth. But this is what's coming, obviously. And look, what have we been saying I've been writing about this for over a decade, that this is all going to be part of the ability of the spy agencies, all of them together, to collect all the data and to know everything about you. And what they're going to do with that information, this is all detailed in my book, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, is to be able to socially engineer and control the future. Now, they don't actually have the ability to predict the future, but what they do use, as I wrote in my Minority Report analysis, is predictive algorithms that give high-level accuracy about what events might transpire. That's what Jade Helm was, by the way. I did several articles and interviews on the basis of Jade Helm as a kind of AI predictive software. But here is, again, Petraeus telling you straight up 6 years ago, exactly what was going on, that they will use the Internet of Things and all of this web, right? This is what the internet was created for the entire time. This was the whole purpose of the internet, is not just to spy on you. You see, it's not about, we're going to, get some lone nut guy out there. Rather, it's about mass movements. It's what you see in Isaac Asimov's book Foundation, where Hari Seldon creates a mass tracking algorithm by which he can try to predict future movements of large sections of populations, right? Now, I mean, yeah, they could use individual instances. Perhaps that's what happened to Michael Hastings. We know that this Vault 7 material talks about hacking cars, smart cars, all of that. Now, this was what all of this was about the whole time, every bit of it. Listening to the first half of my analysis of Vault 7, WikiLeaks, and Trump wiretapping. This is Jay Dyer from Jay's Analysis. If you'd like to purchase my book, which deals with a lot of this, that just came out and now has over 40 5-star reviews across markets, you can go to jaysanalysis.com, and there's a tab at the top where you can get a signed copy directly from me. And there's a PayPal tabs for inside and outside the U.S. If you want to hear the rest of this talk, you can also subscribe at jaysanalysis.com for $4.95 a month or for $60 a year, where you get access to the full archives, interviews, talks, and lectures. Thank you for listening.